Welcome to the Faith Bible Church podcast. We hope the message you're about to hear is a blessing in your growth in Jesus Christ. We also pray that the message is not a substitute for your critical place in the local church and in community. Thanks again for joining us. Again, welcome everyone tuning in online. My name's Scott, lead pastor. It's great to be with you. Welcome everyone this morning. Happy Father's Day. Great to be with you. I've told you before about how I met the Lord at my first semester at Texas A&M University. Always wait a second after you say that. Thank you, friends. In the just about 6 or 7 weeks there, and I had a lot of the bits and details of theology and theism. I believe that God existed, etc. But no one had ever meaningfully sat down with me and explained the gospel, why Jesus died, why he rose from the dead, and what faith in him actually gave us, what God's grace was all about. That happened about 6 or 7 weeks into school, and my whole life changed. Drastically, immediately, dramatically changed everything about it. I felt a calling from God. I wanted to change my major. I freaked my parents out. I had new friends. It was crazy. Crazy moment. About 1:30 p.m., November 2nd, 1994, I can tell you where I was sitting, who I was sitting with, what he was wearing, what I had eaten for lunch. A lot of you have similar stories. Some of you came to know Jesus in a process, like my wife Liza. There was never a specific moment, but it was a short amount of months where she understood what it was to trust in Jesus. She was much younger than I was 19. Everything changed after that. And again, I told you, I tried wisely to just surround myself with good, godly men who had walked with Jesus longer than I had, which wasn't difficult because I was 10 minutes old in the faith. And so surround myself with these kind of men and just listen. And when they encouraged me to do something, I would most likely do it. One of these gatherings, I was in Bible studies multiple times. I was just trying to soak up and learn as much as I could. A very large Pacific Islander man named David came and introduced himself to me. And he said, "Hi, my name's David." And I was intimidated. I wasn't as beefy as I am now back then. And so I introduced myself. And he said, "Hey, have you ever been discipled?" And I said, "I don't know what that is." "Nice to meet you, David." And he's like, "I really feel like I'm want to disciple you." And I'm like, again, you're going to have to explain that because I'm not sure what that means. I've read it in the Bible about disciples and such, but he was like, "Well, this is what I have in mind." And we had some mutual friends, and he explained, hey, we would just meet together regularly, pray, walk through life, ask questions with each other. We'd read some Navigator Bible studies together, which I didn't know what that was. And I just said, yes, let's do that. And so we began to meet weekly. I was doing homework in books, and we would get together and talk about it. And I was like, this is amazing. Because this guy had been walking with Jesus for a very long time, and he was just sharing with me, listening to me, pouring into me. I remember one day when he asked me early on, "What do you feel like God has called you to do for the rest of your life?" And I said, "Well, I know that." And he was like, "Really?" And I said, "Yes, it really came to me on that day that I trusted him. I just felt God called me to serve the church, to be involved in the church. I don't know exactly what that means, but I know that God has called me to be in ministry and to do it full time for the rest of my life." And he said, "Scott, you better make real clear sure that is what God wants you to do." And I was like, "Dave, isn't this a good thing? I mean, shouldn't you be celebrating this? Isn't this something to, write home about? Like, hey, you should be like, poo, like, hey, good for you, Scott." Like, and he's like, yes, but you need to make sure. And I was like, "Dave, you're going to have to explain your attitude. Like, I don't understand, right?" And he said, "Scott, the ministry, serving the local church and serving God in ministry is beautiful. Beyond compare, it's beautiful." He said, "But inevitably, there will come a day, or many days, when it's so crushingly difficult that the only thing keeping you there is the fact that you are sure that God called you. So you better make sure." And I was like, "Dave, you have my attention," okay? And so I said, I'm going to have to think about that. And I went and prayed, and it didn't take me long because I was convinced. I was sure. I knew it. In my bones, in my soul, I knew it. And we talked about it more. And I got to tell you, Dave was an incredible friend, but he undersold two things. He never lied to me. He undersold two things. The first thing he undersold was how beautiful ministry is. He used the word indescribable beauty. He was wrong. Undersold it. There's something really heavenly special about walking with people, chasing after Jesus through the hardest points of life and death. I remember one particular day driving downtown Houston to sit with a lady in our church battling cancer for the third time, and sitting with her for hours and asking her about her life and talking with her and praying with her and for her husband and her kids and grandkids. I left that hospital and went to another hospital, just walked down with a woman and her 6-year-old son who had cancer. Played video games with him. Got him queso and chips because that's what he was craving. And that was an unusual craving, so we made that happen as soon as possible. That was a brilliant day. Little boy's with the Lord now. The lady that I visited first is in remission. It's a beautiful day. He also undersold how crushingly difficult it would be. There are several days, probably each year, I allow myself 2 or 3 days when I come home and just want to stop, just want to quit. 2 or 3 days a year. 4 is whining. 2 or 3 is okay. All right? But there are a couple of days when I would come home and just slump in the chair and tell Liza with tears in my eyes, we got to figure out something else to do. She's like, what do you mean? I said, I can't do this anymore. It's just too hard. It's too difficult. It's too complex. And as a good wife who never met Dave, the Pacific Islander, she would listen to me and say, okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's figure it out. And then always she'll come back to the same thing. But what is your calling from God? I'm like, okay, I know. We'll work it out. We get up and pray our way through it, and we see God's victory. I say all this in an awkward way. I don't want to make this too much about me this morning. I apologize for that. But we have a text that's quite awkward in our study. It's written to the church about pastors and elders, about the leaders. And if you've read ahead, you know that it is a little awkward for me to teach. But I'm going to embrace the awkwardness, and we're going to talk about it anyway, because it's my calling to preach to you the whole counsel of God. We can't just pick and choose the text that we study. And when we study a book like this, we just go to the next verse, and we do it with accuracy. We do it with prayer and with preparation. And we're going to read these 2 verses, only 2 verses today, but they are a little awkward. They'll be awkward for me, not for you, hopefully. But as I read them, I want to tell you a couple things. If you hear me complaining at all in these texts, then you're not really hearing me. If you hear me suggesting some sort of preferential or special treatment in a higher way for me or people like me, then you're not hearing me. And what I want to do is approach these 2 verses speaking to 3 specific groups of people. First is you, because it was written to the church family. Second is me. And third is other pastors and church leaders and elders like me in our church and others. And so with that great preface, why don't we get to the 2 verses in 1 Thessalonians 5? You want to open your Bibles? We'll be in 1 Thessalonians 5. I encourage you to bring your Bibles with you. It almost always will be up on the screen. For us, we're in our series called Future Glory, Present Trial, and we're near the end of the first book. And we'll take a break right at the beginning of school, and then we'll jump into 2 Thessalonians, and I'm really excited about that one. That one's shorter, denser, and it's got so many brilliant things to discuss. We are in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 12 and 13. Here's a quick recap. The first 3 chapters of the book, written about the year 50 AD by Paul, whom formed the church in Thessalonica, cosmopolitan port city in northern Greece. Was there maybe 3 months or so and got run out of town and wrote this letter back to the church just maybe a few months later. Again, the year 50. First 3 chapters are an introduction, very, very proud, love-laced introduction. We don't get to the body of the text until chapter 4 when he says, I want to talk to you about sanctification. Sanctification, the way we define it, is the lifelong process of embodied holiness. He says, I want to talk to you about sanctification. I want to talk to you about holiness, specifically sexual immorality. Let's talk about that. Then I want to talk about love for one another. And then he says, some of you are struggling because some of you new believers have died and you're expecting Jesus to return or for you to be raptured before that happens. And that's already happened. So I want to tell you about that. And then last week we talked about the times and epochs of the end, the order of events, and how that should encourage us and want us to build up one another and encourage one another. And then he shifts gears with a massive clutch and begins to talk about church leaders to the church. It's a dramatic shift with one 2-letter word in Greek, okay? He just says, boom, now let's talk about something very, very different. He doesn't slowly transition off of eschatology. He says, no, I want to talk about church leadership with no warning. And so we come to chapter 5, verses 12 and 13. Pretty simple text, fits on one screen. Here we go. But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another. Now you see the awkwardness. Let's read it again. But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another. Let's look at this text in an important way. It's very simple, and we'll talk about it simply. The first question is, who is he speaking about? He's obviously and clearly speaking to the church. He's written this letter to the church. He says, brethren. But now we request of you, brethren, brothers and sisters. This is his word, which he used often in this letter, to the church. He's speaking to the church, but who's he speaking about? Let's just look at the text and let's identify who he's speaking about before we identify what he says. Brethren, that you appreciate, now here we go, those who diligently labor among you, have charge over you in the Lord, and give you instruction. So he doesn't offer a title. He doesn't say pastor, which is most often, except for Ephesians chapter 4, most often the word shepherd, both noun and verb in the New Testament. He doesn't say elder. He doesn't say overseer. He doesn't say bishop. He doesn't say deacon. All offices, whether or not they overlap, are synonymous in the New Testament. He doesn't say any of that. He just says, I want to talk to you about this group of people, those who diligently labor, those who have charge over you in the Lord, and those who teach you or admonish you, give you instruction. I don't think anybody thinks that he's talking to 3 different groups, the laborers, the charge folks, and the teachers. I think he's using these 3 participles in Greek to describe this group of people. They're obviously leaders in the church, those who have charge over you. And knowing from Acts chapter 14, verse 23, Titus chapter 1, verse 5, Paul says that everywhere he goes, in all the churches, he sets up leaders. He calls them elders in those 2 places. He sets up elders in the church, a plurality of leading men. Now, when you get to the qualifications of elders in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 and the job description in 1 Peter 5, you see that they line up with this pretty well. Elders, which I understand is largely synonymous with the word pastor and probably bishop, overseer, they are the ones who diligently labor for the church. They are the ones who have charge over the church in the Lord, and they are the ones who are supposed to teach. Elders are all supposed to be able to teach. So it seems to me that Paul is clearly speaking of church leaders, including pastors, elders. I identify those synonymously, perhaps even deacons. He's talking to church leaders. And what does he say about them? He's speaking to the church, and this is what he says. We request of you, brethren, that you appreciate these people. That's the first one. And then verse 13 has the second one, that you esteem them. Now, why? Why would Paul need to say this? It's a little awkward for me to talk to you about how you're supposed to treat me and people like me. Okay? Can you embrace that with me for a second? A few years ago, we read a book among our staff, 41 small chapters, which is great for discussions. We'd read a couple chapters at a time, and every week we would talk about it. It took us a long time. It's called Replenish by Lance Witt. It's a book just for church leaders, talking about how to restore spiritual health and vitality. Okay? In the first chapter, he shares some statistics that he got from the Barna Group, from Focus on the Family, from Fuller Seminary, and the Institute for Church Leadership Development about pastors. This was written in 2011. So it's 10 years old, I get it. But ask yourself this question as I read these statistics to you. Would these get better or worse for pastors after a worldwide pandemic? First one. 1,500 pastors leave the ministry permanently each and every month in America. 80% of pastors and 85% of their spouses feel discouraged in their roles, significantly discouraged. 70% of pastors do not have a close friend, confidant, or mentor. Over 50% of pastors are so discouraged that they would leave the ministry if they could, but have no other way of making a living. Over 50% of pastors' wives feel that their husband entering ministry was the most destructive thing to ever happen to their families. 71% of pastors say that they were burned out and they battled depression beyond fatigue on a weekly, even a daily basis. And the last one, only 1 in 10 pastors will retire as a pastor. Now, I share that with you not for you to have some sort of manufactured pity or sympathy for me as a speaker, as a pastor. I would like to illustrate for you best I can the difficulty and challenges it is to be a leader in a church. There are some things that are unique, if you would indulge the expression, about leading in a church that you won't really find almost anywhere else. You can be a counselor, you can work for an oil and gas company, you can be a teacher, you can be a stay-at-home dad, stay-at-home mom, you can do anything. You can do a CPA, you can do whatever. But largely, you leave that role when you come to church on Sundays. And then you interact with people not as what you do during the week, but you interact with people as a disciple, as a mom, as a dad, as a friend, as a member of a small group or an adult community, etc. For pastors and servants, for elders, not just me, but our pastoral staff, our deacons, in some large sense, our full church staff, our elders, there is no line between that and here, there and here. It's all one. It's difficult for families. It's difficult to struggle sometimes with sin and difficulty and mistakes because there's an expectation that may not be proper in some sense. I wrote down a couple of things just by way of illustration for church leadership. Again, if you hear me complaining in this, you're not hearing me. If you hear me asking for some sort of preferential treatment, you're not hearing me. I just want to teach the text and help us all understand which way love is supposed to flow in the church. Which way does love flow in the church? Do you know, I hope you do, that there is a difference between spiritually mature church leaders and gifted church leaders? The two aren't necessarily the same. And do you know, have you read any headlines in the church about how destructive an experience can be when we assume that simply gifted people are spiritually mature? They are not the same thing. Let me let you in on a little secret. Getting up and doing what I do on Sunday mornings, just speaking to you from the scriptures for 40 minutes or so, you don't have to love Jesus to do it. I hope over time you can sniff it out if a person doesn't. But you don't have to be spiritually mature to do it. You can fake it for a while. Gifted, charismatic, eloquent speakers do it all the time. They're doing it now, somewhere. There is a difference. And so church leadership is not just about giftedness. The great McShane, he was a churchman of the early 19th century. One of my favorite of his quotes. It says, I wrote it down for this occasion. It is not great talents God blesses, so much as great likeness to Jesus. So there's a difference between gifted people and spiritually mature people. Hopefully, church leadership, we marry those two things together. Hopefully, right? But they're not always the same. Some people misunderstand roles of church leadership as a role of authority and even autonomy. You can do what you want. You can go where you want. People will follow you. Whereas the truth is, it's primarily a role of responsibility and burden. It's very different. Some people misunderstand this as a place and a role of greater freedom. I think biblically it's right to understand this as a role of greater judgment. The scriptures say, be careful, those of you who want to be teachers in the church, for you will incur a stricter judgment. Some people misunderstand this as a role of superiority. They lead with pastor. My name is pastor. My name is elder. My name is deacon, whatever. And they lead in that into the room. They always kind of head first. They wobble when they go into the room. And this is a role, church leadership, of superiority, where the truth of the scripture says this is a role of sacrifice, not superiority. In fact, the way that Paul speaks in 1 Thessalonians 5 is it's almost, there's no line, there's no above. He's talking to a group of people within a group of people. It's level. Some people misunderstand this as a leader who's not allowed to be weak or have faults or make mistakes. Whereas the truth of it is all church leaders, men, women, in any role, are disciples just like you. And they struggle with sin just like you. Yes, at the same time, they're supposed to be moral and spiritual examples. They're supposed to be leading examples of great character. But they still struggle. They still have a story. Can I tell you my story? I grew up in a small town you know of, good family. Theistic underpinnings. I was at church all the time, even though I didn't understand, right? I grew up a very, very lonely child, and I hated it. And so loneliness over time led to a fear of abandonment because I didn't want to be lonely. So anytime I got close to people, I feared that they would leave me and I would be lonely again. I just didn't like being alone. That fear of loneliness eventually became codependency with these kinds of peoples that I were around and were a good relationship with. And it took me, it took me 40 years plus to figure that out. And I'm telling you, as a church leader, codependency can cause a lot of trouble. A lot of trouble. And it did for me. But until good men, godly confidants, mentors, friends, many of them are in this room, came around me and said, hey, Scott, there's a better way of doing things. Let's help you see some of these things. The regeneration program, my incredible wife, a good biblical counselor, and many, many friends walk with me. And I feel, after many years, my story is still being written, and I'm still on a long journey, but I feel like a new guy, I feel like a new man because of some of these things I just have begun to see. That's my story. Every pastor has a story like that. Every church leader has a story like that. They have a home of origin story. They have a church of origin story. They have difficulties. Some of them they don't understand. They have great blind spots, as I still do and you still do. They have fears and anxieties, and they're all trying to work it out as a disciple just like you are. Some people misunderstand this role as, listen, the perfect balance between winsome speaker and tactical leader and business savvy guru and financial expert and dinner party star and marital co-counselor and missionary evangelist. It's just like we have the cape and the boots and the mask, and we just show up. Boom, we land. Anybody need me today? Whereas the reality is, we're all a unique set of spiritual gifts just like you. And not very many of them, but a couple, a few like you. And we're not experts in everything. No church leader is a superhero. You have to decape the pastor without demonizing the disciple or disrespecting the calling. It's a lot of nuance to this. I told you it was awkward because I feel a bit like I hope, and let me just say this, indulge this for me, I don't want to be trying to convince you of something by way of thinking a certain way about me or men and women like me or our elders or our pastors on our church staff. I'm just trying to simply teach the text. Look back at 1 Thessalonians 5, but we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently serve, those who have charge over you, those who teach, that you appreciate. That word appreciate is actually a unique word in the Greek text, and it's used everywhere. It just means to know. It's used a lot of times. But that's weird. We ask that you know those who diligently labor. Well, of course I know them. What do you mean? Know their name? Know their family? Know their address? Of course I know that. Well, of course, that's not what Paul is talking about. So if you look at the translations, NIV, ESV, New King James, etc., you get recognize, respect, acknowledge, honor, and appreciate. This is talking about some sort of value placed in knowing these people. I think appreciation is a perfectly accurate word, that you appreciate. Let me tell you a little bit more of my story, and again, another fear of making this all about me. Liza, my wife, and I, and my two kids, Andrew and Isabel, have felt deeply appreciated by you. Deeply. Especially over the last several years. The height of my wife's chronic illness and pain with several brain surgeries and ongoing neuropathy and pressure headaches and a cerebral spinal fluid leak that we still can't find. You have blessed us in ways beyond our ability to count. In gifts of flowers and candles, which are Liza's favorite, or meals or gift cards, or even better. We have lost track. We used to keep them in a journal, every gift, every name, every address, and Liza would handwrite thank you cards. I hope a lot of you in this room have gotten handwritten thank you cards from my wife, because a lot of you have appreciated and blessed us tremendously. I don't know how somebody makes it through a story of chronic pain or death or difficulties like infertility or whatever without the support of a church family. But I can tell you, many pastors do. Many church leaders do. Because for some reason, community is a little harder for them. It's more difficult, perhaps to their personality, perhaps because of their job description, perhaps because of their relationships. It's probably quite complex. But we have felt incredibly appreciated by you, and we're very, very grateful for that. Appreciate those who diligently labor among you, have charge over you in the Lord, and give you instruction. And then the second one, verse 13, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. That's a mouthful. You esteem them very highly in love because of their work. There's some background texts to 1 Thessalonians 5 that I think are important. That will help us on this second half. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. Maybe not written by Paul, but maybe. Obey your leaders and submit to them. Boom, we get two really big words right out of the gate. Okay, obey and submit, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. I have to tell you, the last couple of words of the verse is surprising to me. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for them, is what I would expect. Hey, pastors and leaders, these people that the writer of Hebrews is talking about, hey, let's make sure you support them because we want their lives to be profitable. But that's not what he says. Let these leaders do this as you follow them joyfully and support them and care for them. As they watch over your souls, as people who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. He's writing to the church, and he says, church, it's unprofitable for you when your pastors lead out of grief. That's surprising. Largely based on this one verse, a guy named Christopher Ashe was led to write a book. He's a publisher in residence for Tyndale Publishing. He lives in England, and this is the book title. The book your pastor wishes you would read but is too embarrassed to ask. It's a short little book. I highly recommend it. But I'm too embarrassed to ask. 7 virtues. 7 simple virtues that he says the church can live out in a way to care for their pastor and church leaders. Incredible. He's writing it as a former pastor, as a present church member. All very biblical, quite encouraging. 7 virtues, and the other side of the coin, the 7 vices to those 7 virtues that describe the flow of love in the church. Go back to 1 Thessalonians 5. And that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. This word esteem is, it's also used quite often in the New Testament. It does mean that, to show deference, to show respect and honor, to be on the side of, to think well of. I can tell you, the most difficult parts of church leadership for me in recent years has not been engagement, it's not been relationships, it's been decisions made for ministries and vision and staff and different things in the background. Those tend to be the hot buttons for engagement and relationship. And I think it's important to understand what Paul is suggesting. He says, hey, I need you to understand the difficulty and the challenges of those who diligently labor among you, those who have charge over you in the Lord, those who instruct you or admonish you. Esteem them, appreciate them, because this is difficult. I think it's what he's saying. It's difficult. And as awkward it is for me to tell you that from the scriptures, it's difficult. It's unique. It's challenging. It's complex. I'll give you one example. I love completed projects. I love them. That's why I love spreadsheets. Even though I'm an artist, I kind of like spreadsheets, and I like them when they're complete. I also like woodworking because when I design a piece of furniture and then I build it and I do all of that sanding, buffing, I put the coat on, I wait, I put another coat on, and then I'm done, boom, it is finished. You know what is finished in ministry? Nothing. It's always unfinished. Because we're talking about souls and hearts and relationships and spiritual walks and journeys. It's always unfinished. Always. And sometimes that can be very unnerving for people who like to complete things. It's unique. I never finish a project and move on to another one. We can complete a book, we can complete a Bible study, but there's always an unfinished nature to it. It's unique. Esteem them, appreciate them. I hope that you understand. Hebrews, what about 1 Peter 5? 1 Peter 5, therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ and partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you. Job description of church leaders, elders, pastors. Job description, shepherd the flock of God among you. Exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, yet not as lording it over those who are allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. We have a title, elders. We have a job description, shepherd the flock of God among you. We have an organizational structure. You are an under shepherd. You have a chief shepherd above you. You're going to answer to him. and Him alone. And if you do it right, you receive the unfading crown of glory. There's 5 specific crowns mentioned in the New Testament. I wonder if these aren't at least part of the rewards that we get at the Bema judgment seat of Jesus, and then we take those off and lay them at the feet of Jesus. It's going to be a beautiful moment. 1 Timothy 5. The elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor. It's going to get more awkward in just a second, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing, and labor is worthy of his wages. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses." That first part is okay. The second part, the last phrase, "Do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses." Think about that. Quite a bit of a shift in the middle. Hey, support, give him support, and then, assume difficulty and attack. Assume it. And don't listen to it, except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's why Paul says so powerfully, appreciate and esteem. Go back to the text and we'll finish. I want to respond in worship today. The last phrase, live in peace with one another. Live in peace with one another. Let's wrap up. Here's my big idea. What is the direction of love flowing in the church? The Father has designed His church to love in all directions. That means that you're supposed to love one another, that I'm supposed to love you, that you're supposed to love me and church leaders, and we're supposed to love the world outside. The Father has designed His church for love to flow in all directions. In all directions. And this last phrase is beautiful. The last phrase of the text, live in peace with one another. I would suggest to you that the theme of the book so far, if you were to boil it all down, would not be peace, but the opposite of peace. It would be conflict and war, battle. He says to the church over and over, I'm so proud that you are standing firm in the faith, that you are boldly preaching the gospel of God amid much opposition. You are being afflicted and suffering at every turn. It's the context of war and battle, and then he says, live at peace with one another. Let me tell you, friends, there is peace that's possible within the battle. But you know what's difficult? Is when we don't know who the enemy is, we misunderstand and confuse ourselves for the enemy. When we don't know where the battle line is, we confuse and misunderstand, and we begin to draw battle lines between ourselves where we're supposed to have peace. A friend of mine recently told me that every 40-year-old man has a decision to make when he turns 40. He's either going to get really serious about World War II or really serious about smoking meats. I originally chose World War II. I'm looping back around to smoking meats. But anyway, after Germany and the Third Reich surrendered in World War II, tens of thousands of soldiers continued to die. Do you know what kind of soldiers? Drunk soldiers, distracted soldiers, confused soldiers, idle soldiers that didn't have an understanding of who they were fighting. They were killing each other, literally, tens of thousands of them. It happens in the church too. When we don't understand that the enemy has a tactic. Listen, if I were the enemy of the church and of God, I would square my crosshairs on the leaders of the local church. I could do a lot of damage that way. And because of that attack and because of foolishness and sin and terrible choices by church leaders all the time, we are confused about who the enemy is and where the battle lines are. And Paul says, even within the battle, there's a possibility for peace in the ranks of the church. And in fact, it's supposed to be that way. We are all supposed to know we're on the same team. We love each other. And in the Father's designed church, love flows in all directions. And we are with one accord in unity, fighting the enemy of God. And on the mission of God to serve the church and the kingdom of God together. And only when we can do that together Can there be peace even within the battle? There's a couple of applications to this that I don't want to miss, and then we're going to respond. Applications are, I hope that you say thank you to everyone all the time, especially when we gather in the church. Not just to each other, but to church leaders, deacons, servants, staff members. Every time you walk in a door held by somebody, or go to the kids' ministry and you checked in by somebody, or take your kids and students over to student ministry and checked in by somebody, you should say thank you when they hand you a communion cup. You should say thank you when they hand you a book. Say thank you profusely all the time. I hope our church family is described and defined by gratitude. Respect the challenges of church leadership. Just try to understand that it may be a little bit more complex and difficult than you can conceive, that you can understand at that moment. If you ask questions, we'll bring you in, I'm sure. Share the burden of the leader. You want to get into the groove of church leadership? Get to know them and share their burdens. I can tell you, the best way to get over discontentment is the church is strap on your gloves and bring out your ugly shoes and let's get working together in the same row. Because when we're planting seeds and harvesting together, discontentment seems to go away. If you share the burden of church leadership, things get really simple. In fact, fully engage the mission as a committed follower is what I mean. And then lastly, I would just say as an encouragement to your pastor, it's okay to grumble. It's okay to have different opinions. It's okay to not like some of the ministry decisions we make. We welcome all of that. We really do. We welcome it in a holy way. But I would just ask that if you have that, grumble to God for a long time before you grumble to someone else. Take it to him first and see if he can't or iron out the wrinkles first with the Lord. Father has designed his church for love to flow in all directions. In all directions.